Evan Blake had everything: power, wealth, control, until a single moment left him in a wheelchair and completely alone, and then the woman he once left behind appeared at his door with two boys who looked just like him. Evan Blake had always existed in the world from above. He lived at the top floor of a luxury high-rise, ran a billion-dollar tech empire, and walked through life like a man immune to consequences. Everything about him projected control: his tailored suits, his sharp jawline, his commanding voice. With dark hair always neatly styled and eyes as cold and clear as glass, he was the kind of man who walked into a room and shifted the atmosphere without needing to speak. People admired him. Some feared him. Many envied him. And he, in return, kept his distance, investing his heart in algorithms and market trends instead of people. But one mistake changed all of it. It happened during a weekend retreat in the mountains, an executive getaway he hadn't even wanted to attend. The road had been wet, the turn too sharp, and the car too fast. When he woke up in the hospital, he couldn't feel his legs. Doctors explained the damage in clinical terms, words like spinal trauma, permanent, T9 vertebra. All he really heard was that life as he knew it was over. They told him he was lucky to be alive. He didn't feel lucky. In the weeks that followed, the world that once orbited around him began to fall away. His assistant, who used to hang on his every word, asked to be reassigned. Board members who once praised him with glossy smiles stopped returning his calls. Investors grew nervous. Shareholders panicked. Rumors swirled in boardrooms and online forums. Soon he was quietly removed from the company he had built from the ground up, replaced by someone younger, faster, fully capable. Evan returned home not to flowers or support but to silence. His penthouse, once a sleek symbol of success, now felt cold and echoing. The elevator opened to polished marble floors and a sweeping view of the skyline, but none of it felt like his anymore. Even the view had lost its meaning. He wheeled through the rooms like a stranger in a place built for someone else, someone who could stand, walk, move without help. People disappeared faster than he expected. Business contacts drifted away. Friends sent short messages that dried up after a week or two. There were no more dinner invitations, no more event galas. It was as if his value had been erased the moment he could no longer stand behind a podium or shake hands at a table. And for a while, Evan accepted it. He didn't fight. He let the silence take over. He stopped answering calls. He stopped looking in mirrors. He let the days bleed together, one after another, in a blur of pain management, physical therapy, and the dull ache of isolation. Somewhere in the middle of all that, he began to believe what the world had implied, that his story was over. Then one day, everything changed again, not through headlines or injury, but through the sound of a doorbell. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never was. He wheeled himself slowly through the hall toward the front door, his hands steady on the metal rims. When he opened it, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. A woman stood there, long brown hair tucked behind her ears, eyes dark and familiar. Clara. From a lifetime ago. And standing beside her, no, holding each of her hands, were two little boys. Twins. Identical. Dark hair. Piercing blue eyes. Just like his. Clara's voice was soft, but unwavering. "Hi, Evan," she said. "I saw the news. I know it's been a long time, but I couldn't stay away." She looked down at the boys, then back at him. "These are your sons." For a moment, Evan couldn't move or speak. The hallway seemed to narrow around him, the air thick with disbelief. He stared at Clara, then at the two boys standing beside her. His mind scrambled for logic, for timelines, for any explanation that would make this moment make sense. But all he could see were their faces, two boys who looked unmistakably like him, staring up with wide eyes that mirrored his own. They weren't babies. They were old enough to stand on their own, to hold their mother's hands with confidence, to understand that something important was happening. That made them 6. Maybe 7. Evan blinked, trying to process the math, the implication, the years he had lost without even knowing they existed. Clara didn't press him. She just stood there, holding their gaze, her expression unreadable but steady. There was no accusation in her voice, no bitterness. Just truth, plain and painful. "Can we come in?" she asked gently. Evan finally nodded, moving aside to let them in, his hands trembling slightly on the wheels of his chair. The boys stepped in first, taking in the tall ceilings and gleaming floors, their movements quiet and cautious. Clara followed, her steps slow, as if unsure of her place in this space. Evan led them into the living room. He gestured toward the couch, then positioned himself across from them, still speechless. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the city beyond the glass windows. Finally, Clara spoke. "Their names are Liam and Jake," she said, her voice softer now. "They're 6. I found out I was pregnant just a few weeks after you left." He exhaled sharply. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out broken, not in anger but in disbelief. She looked down at her hands for a moment before answering. "You had already made your decision. You were gone, and I didn't want to chase someone who clearly didn't want to be caught. I thought I was doing the right thing, giving them peace, not uncertainty." Evan's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure if the sting in his chest was anger at her choice or shame at his own absence. "I would have come back. If I'd known, Clara, if I had even suspected." "I know," she said. "But I didn't know who you were going to be anymore. You chose your career, and I chose to protect them. I had to do what I thought was best." Liam shifted on the couch, climbing up next to Clara and resting his head on her shoulder. Jake sat on the edge, watching Evan with curiosity rather than fear. There was something in his gaze that made Evan's throat tighten. It wasn't judgment. It was longing. A wordless, childlike hope that the stranger across the room might become something familiar. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. She handed it to Evan without a word. Inside were photos, birthdays, school pictures, snapshots of the boys at the beach, in Halloween costumes, sleeping curled up on a couch. He flipped through them slowly, each image a punch to the gut. 6 years of memories he had missed. First steps. First teeth. First words. First everything. "I'm not here to punish you," Clara said quietly. "I didn't come because I want anything. I came because I saw what happened to you, and I couldn't not come. I knew you were alone. And I thought, maybe they deserve to meet the other half of where they come from. Even if it's just once." Evan looked up from the photos, his eyes glassy. "Just once," he repeated. "You think I can look at them and then go back to pretending they don't exist?" Clara's expression wavered. "I don't know what you want, Evan. Or what you're capable of right now. I just knew you deserved the chance to meet them. And maybe, they deserve the chance to know you." He looked at the boys again. Jake gave him a tentative smile. Liam peeked over Clara's shoulder, then hid his face again. Evan swallowed the lump in his throat. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Clara nodded. "Maybe that's why we're here. To figure it out together." The first night with Liam and Jake in his apartment was quiet, but it wasn't the silence Evan had grown used to over the past few months. It was different now, softer, filled with the rustle of small footsteps and whispered questions, the occasional creak of a door opening or the gentle splash of bathwater. Clara had unpacked a few things from a bag she brought, pajamas, toothbrushes, a favorite book with a torn cover that clearly had been read more times than it could withstand. She moved around the space as if trying not to disturb anything, not sure where she fit in this version of Evan's life. She wasn't a guest, but she wasn't at home either. Evan watched from the doorway as Clara helped the boys settle into the guest bedroom. They hadn't asked many questions. Jake had been the more curious of the two, wandering the halls, pointing at things, asking what buttons did. Liam stayed close to Clara, quiet but observant. Evan had offered to help, but Clara had smiled gently and said, "Let me do it tonight." Everything's new for them. So he waited, feeling strange in his own home, like a bystander to something that should have belonged to him long ago. When the boys were finally asleep, Clara returned to the living room. She looked tired, the kind of tired that years of single parenting left in a person's bones. Evan motioned toward the kitchen and asked if she wanted tea, and she nodded gratefully. They sat in silence for a while, sipping from mismatched mugs, the only light coming from the small lamp near the couch. Outside, the city sparkled, but the room felt still, like the world had shrunk down to just the two of them. "I don't know what happens now," Clara said finally, her voice quiet. "I didn't plan any of this. I didn't even know if you'd open the door." "I didn't know what to say," Evan admitted. "I still don't." "You don't have to know everything," she replied. "Not right away." He glanced toward the hallway where the boys slept. "They're amazing. They're incredible. And I missed all of it." Clara didn't argue, didn't soften the truth. "Yes. You did." It stung, but it needed to sting. He couldn't take back the years he'd lost, and she wasn't going to pretend he could. But she hadn't come to punish him, and she wasn't trying to hold guilt over his head. She was just giving him the truth and waiting to see what he would do with it. "Why did you really come, Clara?" he asked. "Was it just the news? Or, was there more?" She hesitated for a moment, then looked him in the eye. "I came because I saw that you were alone. And I remembered the man I once knew. I thought maybe he was still in there somewhere. I wanted to believe you deserved another chance, not just with them, but with yourself." Evan didn't know how to respond. His entire life had been about control, success, keeping things polished and perfect. But now nothing was perfect. He was sitting in a wheelchair in a home that suddenly felt full of people and noise and memory. And he didn't feel powerful. He felt exposed. But beneath that, something else had started to form, something like purpose. Clara stood and said she would sleep on the couch. Evan offered to give her the guest room, but she declined. "Let them wake up in a bed, not on the floor. They need that more than I do." She disappeared down the hall, and Evan was left alone in the living room. He wheeled closer to the window, looking out over the city he had once ruled like a king. It looked different now. Smaller. Farther away. And yet, what had come through his front door that day felt bigger than anything he had ever built. It wasn't a merger or a company or an empire. It was family. Something he hadn't known he was missing until it showed up in the form of two boys who looked exactly like him. That night, for the first time since the accident, Evan didn't feel afraid to fall asleep. Morning came slowly, with golden light creeping through the edges of the curtains and spilling onto the hardwood floors. Evan woke up earlier than usual, his body still stiff from sleep but his mind already turning. He had barely rested the night before, not because of pain or discomfort, but because the apartment, his apartment, no longer felt like a quiet fortress. It felt alive. Every few hours, he had heard the soft shuffle of tiny feet in the hallway or the low murmur of Clara's voice whispering a lullaby to one of the boys. It was unfamiliar, yes, but strangely comforting. When he wheeled into the kitchen, he found Clara already awake, her hair tied back, wearing a simple sweater and leggings. She was quietly pouring cereal into two bowls, and Liam and Jake were seated at the small breakfast table, still in their pajamas, swinging their feet as they waited. The moment they saw Evan, Jake grinned and waved enthusiastically, while Liam offered a small, polite smile. Clara looked over her shoulder and gave Evan a nod of quiet acknowledgement, like they had silently agreed to start the day without ceremony or tension. "Hope you don't mind," she said. "They get hungry the second they open their eyes." Evan shook his head. "Not at all. I'm glad you're here." He watched as Clara helped Jake with a spoon, gently brushing cereal dust off his chin, and then turned to check Liam's milk. It was natural, seamless, and filled with a softness Evan couldn't stop staring at. She had done this all by herself for 6 years. She had been the entire world for these boys, and now she was here, letting him into that world with quiet grace. He felt humbled by it. After breakfast, the boys asked if they could explore the apartment, and Clara gave them permission. They wandered off into the living room, giggling and pointing at things as if they were in a museum full of treasures. Evan and Clara sat at the table, sipping coffee in a silence that was no longer uncomfortable. It felt like something was rebuilding itself between them, not quickly, not easily, but piece by piece. "I'm sorry for not being there," Evan said suddenly. "Not just for leaving you, but for everything I missed. I can't fix the past, but I want to be present now. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I want to try." Clara looked at him for a long time. Her expression was calm, but her eyes shimmered with something he couldn't name, sadness, maybe, or hope. "I'm not here for apologies, Evan. I've had years to carry that weight. What matters to me now is who you're willing to become for them. Not who you were for me." He nodded slowly. It was a fair answer, and it didn't let him off the hook, but it didn't push him away, either. They were standing at the edge of something fragile and new, and neither of them wanted to break it. Later that afternoon, Evan invited the boys to help him in the office. They were fascinated by his computer setup, asking dozens of questions about what all the buttons did. He let them click through harmless programs and watched as they argued over whose turn it was. For the first time in months, he laughed out loud, really laughed, and it felt like a pressure valve releasing in his chest. They didn't care that he was in a wheelchair. They didn't ask about the accident. To them, he was just a grown-up with cool gadgets and a funny voice when he read in silly accents. That evening, Clara made pasta while Evan kept the boys entertained with stories about building robots. They all sat around the table like a family, not a perfect one, not yet, but something close. Liam leaned his head on Clara's arm while Jake reached over and placed a sticky hand on Evan's. It was a small gesture, almost nothing. But to Evan, it felt enormous. After the boys were asleep, Clara sat beside Evan on the couch. They didn't talk much. The television played quietly in the background, but neither of them paid attention. Eventually, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to become everything overnight. But don't disappear again." Evan turned to her, his expression soft. "I'm not going anywhere this time." She nodded, then leaned back against the cushion. And in the quiet, they both let go, just a little, of the years that had passed, and made space for something new. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Evan had never known he needed. Each morning began with the sound of small feet running across the floor, followed by sleepy voices asking if breakfast was ready or if they could watch cartoons. Clara took charge of most of the routine at first, but Evan insisted on becoming involved, even when it was awkward or slow or unfamiliar. He learned how to pour just the right amount of cereal without spilling it, how to tie tiny shoelaces from his seated position, and how to soothe a child's frustration with calm instead of control. It wasn't natural at first. He had spent so much of his adult life giving orders, having assistants, solving problems with logic. But children didn't respond to logic the same way. They responded to presence, tone, and consistency. And Evan was beginning to understand that showing up, really showing up, mattered more than having all the answers. He found himself watching Clara more than he realized. Not out of romantic longing, though that quiet pull was still there, but out of admiration. She had raised 2 boys on her own while carrying the weight of silence between them. She didn't ask for help, didn't expect gratitude, and didn't show resentment. She simply moved forward, making sure her sons were fed, clothed, and loved. It humbled him. She hadn't just survived, she had built something meaningful, something warm and whole. One afternoon, while the boys were down the hall building something that involved couch cushions and socks, Evan invited Clara out onto the balcony. The view stretched wide, city lights blinking in the distance, the sky starting to change into late afternoon gold. She stepped outside with him, her sweater sleeves pulled over her hands, her face calm. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause, "about what it means to show up now, when I didn't back then. I keep wondering if anything I do will be enough." Clara looked out at the skyline for a moment, then said, "You're not starting from zero, Evan. You're starting from honesty. That's more than most people ever offer." He turned to her. "What if I mess it up?" She smiled, just slightly. "You will. That's part of it. But they don't need perfect. They need real." The words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. That night, when Jake had a nightmare and cried out, Evan was the first one to reach him. He wheeled down the hallway in the dark, heart pounding, unsure if he could even comfort a child. But when he entered the room and saw Jake sitting up in bed with tears on his face, Evan didn't hesitate. He held out his arms. Jake crawled into his lap and rested his head against Evan's shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world. Evan stayed there for a long time, holding him, whispering stories until the small boy's breathing slowed and his body relaxed. Liam wandered into the room a little while later, blinking sleepily. "Is Jake okay?" he asked softly. "He is now," Evan said. "Are you staying in the chair forever?" Liam's question was blunt, without cruelty. "I think so," Evan replied honestly. "Okay," Liam said after a moment. "I just wanted to know." "I don't mind." And then he leaned against the side of Evan's chair, resting his head on the armrest, as if that was enough assurance for him to fall asleep. That moment, quiet, unfiltered, deeply human, was when Evan realized that love wasn't measured in what he had missed, but in what he was doing now. He couldn't go back in time, but he could choose to be here, every day, in all the messy and imperfect ways that mattered. When Clara found them an hour later, she didn't say anything. She just stood in the doorway for a moment, then walked over and placed a blanket over Evan's shoulders. He looked up at her, his eyes tired but full. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" she asked. "For giving me a second chance before I even knew how to ask for one." By the end of the second week, Evan had settled into something that resembled real life, not the version he had once known, filled with boardrooms and press conferences, but a quieter, more grounded life made of small rituals and human connection. Each morning began with the boys climbing onto his bed and declaring it, wake-up time, even when he had barely slept. Clara would appear moments later with coffee and a weary smile, already in motion before the rest of them had opened their eyes. And somehow, in those gentle moments, Evan began to feel less like an outsider and more like someone they expected to be there. Still, as much as he tried to keep things moving forward, the weight of the past hadn't disappeared. It lingered in quiet corners, in the silence between conversations, in the photos Clara never mentioned, in the way Liam sometimes flinched at raised voices or Jake watched Evan with unspoken questions behind his blue eyes. One evening, after a quiet dinner and a shared cleanup routine, Evan asked Clara to join him on the balcony again. The boys were in their room, fighting over who got which pillow, and laughter echoed faintly down the hallway. Evan stared out over the city for a long moment before speaking. "Do they know why I left back then?" Clara didn't answer right away. She leaned on the railing, eyes fixed on the horizon. "They know we were together. They know you weren't ready. I didn't lie to them, but I didn't fill in the details either. Do they think I abandoned them? They don't know enough to frame it that way. But they've asked why they didn't have a dad. I told them you were someone I cared about once, and that sometimes adults make hard choices that don't always feel right later." Evan exhaled slowly, the guilt heavy in his chest. "I was afraid. I thought I had to choose between being successful and being human. And I chose wrong." Clara looked at him then, her gaze soft but firm. "You were scared, Evan. And you hurt me. But I survived. I built something out of the pieces, and those boys are the best thing I've ever done. I didn't come back to make you feel guilty. I came because I believed, for some reason, that you might be ready now. I am," he said, voice steady despite the emotion rising in him. "Not just for them. For everything." They didn't speak again for a while, but something shifted in that quiet. When they went back inside, Clara kissed the boys goodnight and disappeared into her room. Evan lingered in the hallway, unsure of where he belonged now. He turned toward the boys' door and pushed it open just enough to see them asleep, tangled in blankets and stuffed animals. He rolled closer, watching them, seeing in their small faces pieces of himself, his stubbornness in Liam's brow, his quiet in Jake's posture. He didn't need a DNA test to feel what was already true. These boys were his. And they weren't broken. They were bright, kind, full of potential. What they needed wasn't perfection. It was someone who stayed. The next morning, Evan made pancakes. Terrible ones. Lumpy, uneven, almost burned. But the boys ate them anyway, laughing through syrup-sticky mouths and declaring it the best breakfast ever. Clara raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting him own the moment. Later, they built a fort out of blankets in the living room, and for the first time since the accident, Evan allowed himself to forget everything outside those walls. That evening, as they cleaned up the wreckage of stuffed animals and couch cushions, Jake crawled into Evan's lap and asked, "Are you going to live with us forever?" Evan looked at Clara, then back at Jake. "If you'll have me," he said gently. Jake nodded as if that settled it. "Okay. Then I won't worry anymore." Evan felt something inside him loosen, a knot he hadn't known he'd been carrying since the day of the accident, maybe since long before. He wasn't just rebuilding his life. He was building a home. And though it was still imperfect, still fragile, it was real. And that made it everything. The weeks turned into a full month, and the routine that once felt unfamiliar began to root itself deeply into Evan's life. He no longer woke up to silence or spent his days staring blankly out the window. He had learned how to move through his world differently, not just physically but emotionally. The boys had begun to treat him like he had always been there. They asked him questions constantly, about stars, about how phones worked, about whether pancakes could be dinner again. Their curiosity was endless, and their affection came naturally, without fear or hesitation. Evan realized he didn't need to earn their love through grand gestures, he just needed to keep showing up. One crisp Saturday morning, the four of them went to the park for the first time. Evan was nervous. He hadn't been in public since the accident, not outside a clinic or physical therapy center. But Clara had encouraged him, gently but persistently, saying the boys deserved a day outside and so did he. The park was full of families and energy, the kind that used to make Evan feel out of place. But now, with Liam on one side and Jake on the other, he felt something different, he felt grounded. They took turns pushing Ben's old toy truck through the grass. Clara spread out a blanket and handed out sandwiches while Evan told them stories from when he was a kid. He hadn't talked about his childhood in years, not because it was painful, but because he had trained himself to forget the parts that didn't serve his ambition. Now, he remembered the games, the scraped knees, the long summers, and he saw them reflected in his sons. At one point, Liam fell and scraped his hand on a tree branch. He didn't cry immediately, just looked down at the blood and blinked in surprise. Evan wheeled over without thinking, reaching out for him. "Let me see," he said, his voice calm. Liam climbed into his lap, unbothered by the chair, and held out his hand. Evan cleaned the cut with tissues Clara brought from the bag, kissed his forehead without hesitation, and said, "You're okay. You're brave." Liam nodded, then asked if he could go climb again. Clara watched the whole thing from a short distance, arms crossed, a quiet smile on her face. That night, when the boys were asleep and the apartment had gone still, she joined Evan in the kitchen. He was finishing a cup of tea, the tired kind of quiet on his face that only parents understood. "You've changed," she said gently. He looked up. "Have I?" Yes. You're softer. Slower. In a good way. More open. I think the accident stopped your body, but it also slowed your mind long enough for your heart to catch up. He didn't know how to respond at first. He looked at her for a long moment, then set down his cup. There's something I've been wanting to ask, he said. But I've been waiting for the right moment. Clara leaned against the counter. Ask. I want to be their legal father. Officially. Not just in name. I want to adopt them. Her expression didn't change immediately. She stayed quiet, processing, and Evan could feel the weight of her thoughts behind her stillness. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and full of emotion. They already call you Dad. But if you're sure, if you're ready for everything that comes with it, I think they would be proud to have your name. I'm sure, he said. I want them to know I'm not leaving. Not now, not ever. Clara nodded slowly. Then let's do it. Evan felt something in his chest open wider than it ever had. This wasn't just redemption. It wasn't even a second chance. It was the beginning of a life he never knew he was allowed to have. He had built a company, led teams, stood on stages in front of thousands. But nothing had ever felt as real, or as right, as this. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what came next. The adoption was finalized on a rainy Thursday morning. The courthouse was quiet, almost solemn, with gray walls and muted lighting that made everything feel more intimate. Evan wore a simple navy jacket, not because he had to, but because he wanted to look like he belonged in a moment that felt sacred. Clara wore a soft green dress, the kind she might not have worn years ago, and her hand didn't leave his as they moved through the building. Liam and Jake wore matching button-down shirts and clung to Clara's sides, excitement barely contained beneath their solemn expressions. The judge was kind and efficient. She asked Evan to state his intent, to confirm that he understood what it meant to become their legal parent. He answered without hesitation, his voice steady and full. I understand, he said. And I want it more than anything I've ever wanted. She nodded and turned to the boys, asking if they knew what today meant. Liam spoke first, surprising everyone. It means he's ours forever. Jake followed with a quieter, we already knew that. When the papers were signed, Clara wiped her eyes and kissed each of the boys on the forehead. Evan took a moment longer. He held the certificate in his lap, fingers trembling slightly, and stared at it like it held the entire universe. Because to him, it did. Everything had changed, and yet it felt like this was how it had always been meant to be. They didn't throw a big celebration afterward. Instead, they went to a small bakery and picked out cupcakes. Liam chose chocolate, Jake insisted on something with sprinkles, and Clara chose lemon. Evan didn't choose at all, Jake handed him one with blue icing and said, you need one too. You're the dad now. They ate together at a table by the window while the rain drizzled down outside, and Evan couldn't stop smiling. The days that followed didn't become magical just because of a signature. There were still messes and tantrums, lost socks and homework battles. But something in the air had changed. There was ease now, a quiet confidence that they belonged to each other. Evan found himself humming while making breakfast, laughing at the boys' ridiculous stories, leaning into the chaos of family life with a warmth that had once seemed impossible. He even went back to work, not full-time, not with the same fire, but enough to stay connected. He spoke at events about resilience, about how success means nothing without something real to come home to. His wheelchair no longer defined him. It was part of his story, not the whole thing. One evening, months after the adoption, they were in the backyard under the string lights Clara had helped hang along the fence. The boys ran through the grass, chasing each other with flashlights. Clara sat beside Evan on the patio, barefoot and glowing from laughter. She leaned against his shoulder as he watched the boys, who had started a dance-off with no music at all. Jake ran over and climbed into Evan's lap, tired but smiling. Do you think Mom sees us? Jake asked, almost too quietly. Evan wrapped an arm around him. I think she does. And I think she's proud. Clara looked over, her eyes shimmering in the warm light. She would be. Jake nodded, as if that settled something inside him, then dozed off in Evan's arms, content and safe. As the night deepened, Evan looked around at the life he never expected to have. Not long ago, he had believed his story ended with the crash. That everything after would be a long, quiet descent into isolation. But Clara had walked back into his life carrying not just memories, but meaning. The boys had brought light into a place that had gone cold. And somehow, he had not only survived, he had been transformed. He wasn't the man he used to be, and he didn't want to be. Now, he was a father. A partner. A man who could still build things, only now, they weren't companies. They were moments. Memories. A home. And for the first time in his life, he knew with full certainty that he wasn't missing anything. He had everything he needed right there, tangled in a blanket of laughter, forgiveness, and love. This story isn't just about redemption, it's about the quiet, painful courage it takes to rebuild a life from the inside out. Evan's journey is not one of instant transformation, but of learning how love works when stripped of ego, control, and performance. What makes the ending powerful is not the adoption papers or the perfect image of a family under string lights, but the small moments that got them there, whispered apologies, awkward breakfasts, a child falling asleep in his lap. The final chapter doesn't wrap everything in a perfect bow, and it shouldn't. Life rarely does. But it offers something better, hope that's earned, trust that's rebuilt, and love that grows slowly, stubbornly, and deeply. Evan didn't just regain purpose, he became someone who could finally live with open hands, not clenched fists. That, to me, is the most honest kind of happy ending.